So they started, the Palestinians and the Muslims formed an army and started massacring the Christians. They would go in and take city after city, town after town, and massacre anybody in their way. One of the most famous massacres in Lebanon is the massacre of the Moor. The stories, the atrocities that the Muslims and the Palestinians committed was unbelievable. They would walk into a bomb shelter. They would find a family hiding in a bomb shelter. They would find a mother and a father with a little baby. They would take the baby, tie one leg of the baby to the mother and another leg to the father, and pull the parents apart, splitting the child in half. The biggest disservice the American media did to the American public is not show the beheading of Daniel Pearl and Nick Byrd. I think the American public has the right to see the barbarism that is heading our way. They would walk into our churches. They would urinate and defecate on the altar using the Bible as toilet paper. They would walk into the Christian cemeteries, break the crosses, and get the bodies out of the cemeteries. The last lady that worked for me, I hired her because she was mentally disturbed, because they made her slaughter her own son on her lap. They tied her to a chair, tied a knife to her hand, and made her slaughter her own son. They would crucify the Christian men, build crosses, hang them on a cross, and not only crucify them, but put honey on their chests and their private parts, so the insects would bite them and they would die a painful death. They committed monstrosities that the Western media never reported, because all the media was located in West Beirut, the area that the Muslims controlled, and all the Western media was whipped into political correctness, and nobody wanted to say anything that Yasser Arafat and the Muslims did not allow. We, the Christians, paid the price. We, the Christians, were so good-hearted, we're so open-minded, we're so fair, we're so tolerant, we're so non-judgmental that we refused to read the writing on the wall. When all these things were happening in our country, we put our head in the sand because we could not believe that people who lived amongst us, that our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues could turn against us in a heartbeat once the declaration of Allahu Akbar, the Islamic call to prayer, was called. They surrounded my town in trying to take it over. We were the only last Christian town left in South Lebanon. They surrounded my town to take it over. When they were trying to bomb my town, they bombed my home, bringing it down and burying me under the rubble, wounded, as the perpetrators shouted Allahu Akbar. I ended up in a hospital for 2.5 months and undergone many surgeries. And as a child, laying in a hospital bed, hooked to needles and blood bags on one arm and IV in another arm, and I would look at my parents and I would say, why did they do this to us? And my father would look into my eyes and he would pause. And then he finally said, they hate us because we are Christians. The Muslims consider us infidels and they want to kill us. So I knew since I was 10 years old that my only crime was that I was born into the Christian faith and lived in a Christian town. We ended up leaving the hospital and coming back home. But our home was no longer the home I left. I ended up living in a bomb shelter, underground, with no electricity, no water, no heat, and very little food. To get some food, my mother and I would crawl under snipers' bullets and under the bombs. And we would dig out grass that grew around the bomb shelter and different vegetation and wild dandelions and wild grass that we would dig out and eat. That was the only greenery we had. I learned how to peel thorn in my ripe, tender fingers at age 10 and 11 and 12 so I can eat the stalk that grew inside of the thorn. To get some water, my mother and I would crawl under snipers' bullets to a nearby spring. The name of my town is Marjayun, the Valley of Springs. We had 8 springs in my town. And we would go under snipers' bullets to get some water. And before we left, every time, we would say our last goodbyes because we did not know if we're going to come back alive or dead, simply to get a drink of water. And we would get to the nearby spring. And my mom had to use her stocking on top of the gallon of water to catch all the worms and all the maggots and all the rocks so we can drink the water. And then we would crawl back. To warm up in the middle of the winter, we lived in the mountains and it was so cold. My father would go out into our garden and he would break tree twigs and he would bring them into the bomb shelter and he would pour kerosene and benzene and mazout on them. And he would light a fire and we would huddle around the fire. And we had an agreement because many nights we would fall asleep huddling around the fire because we were freezing cold. And we had an agreement, whoever woke up first would drag the other two outside and slap them on their face until they wake up. Because of carbon monoxide poisoning, we would pass out. And this became my life. And this was my life from age 10 to age 17, living like this, robbed of my youth. Meanwhile, the Muslims and the Palestinians were massacring us, were killing us, were bombing us. I remember when I was 13 years old, one day a friend of ours stopped by, and one of our Christian militia fighters, and he stopped by, he said, I'm just stopping to warn you. I want to tell you that we heard on the radios that the Muslims are planning a big attack against us tonight. And I want to wish you a merciful death in case they kill us. And he left. And after he left, I remember crying, and I asked my mother if I can put on my Sunday best, my Easter dress that she had made for me. It was a blue dress with white flowers because I wanted to look pretty when I'm dead, knowing that there would be no one to bury me. And I remember at age 13 years old, my mother combing my long black hair and tying a white ribbon in my hair that matched the white flowers in my dress. And I was crying, begging her, I don't want to die. I'm only 13 years old. I don't want to die. And there was nothing my mom could say to me. There was nothing she could say. We sat at the corner of our bomb shelter. It was like 5 o'clock in the evening, and we knew the night is coming. And we held each other's hands, my mother, my father, and I, and we said the Lord's Prayer, because there was no one we put trust in, but put our faith in the Lord, that He will protect us, that we will walk in the valley of death, and He will be our shadow, and He will be with us. And my parents held my hand, and they said, when the Muslims come to slaughter us tonight, you just run towards Israel and never look back. We'll create a distraction. We lived a long life. You are young. Just run and never look back. Thank God I didn't have to make that decision that night. And the only reason we stayed alive is that's the night when Israel came in the middle of the night during Operation Litani and started pushing the Palestinians and the Muslims away from us to protect us and set up checkpoints around our area so we can stay alive and they can defend us. We became their buffer zone, the security zone in southern Lebanon. And this went on for another 5 years. And in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. And the only reason Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982 is because Syria and Iran had gotten involved in the war in Lebanon and started financing and supporting and protecting the radical Muslims who were fighting in Lebanon and shelling Israel in the name of Lebanese resistance, to the point the northern towns in Israel, their lives ceased to exist just like us. They were living in bomb shelters. When I hear our president today talk about Syria and Iran, the axis of evil, I look back and I think, where was he living 30 years ago? Syria and Iran are nothing new. Syria and Iran were supporting and financing the terrorist organization, turning Lebanon into a terrorist hub. The Lebanese war was not a war between the Christian Lebanese and the Muslim Lebanese. The Lebanese war was the front lines in the war on terror that started over 30 years ago in the Middle East, and the Muslims started destroying the first and only Christian country in the Middle East because we were much weaker than Israel. We could not protect ourselves. We didn't have an army literally to protect us, and they were able to use our democracy against us, our fair-mindedness against us, our open border policy against us. Iran and Syria were recruiting Muslims from all over the Arabic world who came to fight in Lebanon. They were Muslims coming from Egypt, from Syria, from Saudi Arabia, from Iraq, from Iran, from all over the Arabic world to fight the Christians, to control the Christians in Lebanon, and to create a terror base from which to fight Israel and then launch their attacks against the West. During that bombing, my mother became wounded and we had to take her to an Israeli hospital for treatment. For my mother, it was a life-saving experience. For me, it was a life-changing experience because we ended up going to Israel. And up to that point, I knew that the Israelis were saving our lives. We were alive because of the Israeli army protecting us. But when we went to Israel, that's when I realized that we are truly fighting a clash of civilization between the West and the East, the Judeo-Christian values and the Muslim-Arabic